The silent drive of injustice. Jason Carter's hands trembled slightly as they rested on the steering wheel, gripping the leather tightly, the tension creeping through his fingers and into his soul. It had been a long day in court, but one filled with victory. He had just won another case, exposing police corruption that had plagued the city for years. As a top attorney, Jason was used to the pressure of high-profile cases, but each win came with a heavy reminder. No matter how successful he became, no matter how many systems he dismantled, he was still a black man living in America. And that meant the fight was never truly over. The luxury sedan moved quietly down the darkened streets of his affluent neighborhood, the streetlights casting a soft glow on the manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks. This was his sanctuary, the place where he could leave the courtroom behind and embrace the warmth of his family. His wife, Kira, would likely be inside, reading her favorite book, while his children, Jordan and Maya, would be tucked into bed, their innocent faces unaware of the harsh realities of the world outside. As he pulled into the driveway of his modern two-story home, Jason let out a deep breath. The weight of the day lifted slightly as he reached to turn off the ignition. Suddenly, blinding headlights flooded his vision, forcing him to squint. The harsh red and blue strobe of police lights followed, their intensity washing over his quiet, peaceful street like a wave of chaos. Jason's heart raced, his instincts screaming at him even before the sharp sound of car doors slamming shut pierced the night air. Two police officers approached, their hands hovering near their holstered guns. Jason's breath quickened, a familiar, sickening sensation curling in the pit of his stomach. He had fought against these very injustices in court, had stood before judges and juries arguing against the systemic racism that painted black men as criminals before they were even given a chance to speak. And now, here he was, in front of his own home, feeling the weight of suspicion simply because of the color of his skin. "Step out of the vehicle," one of the officers barked, his voice harsh and filled with authority. Jason's pulse quickened, but his mind raced through the legal steps he knew all too well. Stay calm. Don't make any sudden movements. His lawyer instincts kicked in, but there was something deeper, more primal, that screamed at him to be cautious, because caution was survival. He unfastened his seatbelt slowly, every movement deliberate and controlled. His hands raised slightly as he opened the door. The night air was cool, but a bead of sweat formed on his brow as he stood beside the car, his heart pounding in his chest. "License and registration," the second officer demanded, his tone sharp, like a whip cracking through the stillness of the night. Jason kept his voice measured. "This is my home," he said, gesturing to the house behind him. "I'm just pulling into my driveway. My family is inside." But his words seemed to fall into a void, unheard and ignored. The first officer, a stocky man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, stepped forward aggressively. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description in the area," he said, his eyes narrowing as if daring Jason to argue. "Step away from the car." Jason's stomach knotted. A stolen vehicle? It was ridiculous. This was his car, registered in his name, but he knew better than to argue. He had seen it happen too many times. Men like him, assumed guilty until proven innocent, if they were given the chance to prove it at all. "I have my ID and registration in the glove compartment," Jason replied, keeping his tone calm, though frustration simmered just below the surface. "I can show you." The second officer moved closer, his hand resting on his gun, his eyes flicking toward the house. Jason saw the porch light flicker on, and there, standing in the doorway, was Kira. Her silhouette was backlit by the warm glow of the house, her face painted with confusion and worry. "What's going on?" Kira's voice rang out, her tone sharp with concern. Jason could hear the tremor in her words, the fear that something was terribly wrong. "Go inside, Kira," Jason called back, trying to keep his voice steady, trying to protect her from the storm that was rapidly escalating around them. But the first officer wasn't listening. He moved with alarming speed, shoving Jason against the car. The metal frame bit into Jason's side, pain shooting through his ribs as the officer's knee pressed into his leg, pinning him in place. "You think you're above the law, huh?" The officer snarled, his breath hot against Jason's ear. "Think you can just drive whatever car you want, wherever you want?" Jason gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body tensing as he fought the urge to push back. "This is my car," he ground out through clenched teeth. "My home. My kids are inside." But the officer wasn't listening. His grip tightened as he twisted Jason's arm behind his back, the sharp crack of handcuffs ringing through the air before Jason had time to react. The metal bit into his wrists, cold and unforgiving, locking him in place as if his fate had already been decided. "Stop it. You're making a mistake." Kira's voice cut through the chaos, frantic and desperate. She rushed down the steps toward them, her eyes wide with disbelief. But the officers didn't care. They had their suspect. They had their story. Jason was just another black man in a nice car, another potential criminal who needed to be controlled. The second officer shoved Jason to the ground, the rough pavement scraping against his cheek as he hit the cold concrete. His body ached from the force of the impact, but the real pain came from within, the pain of humiliation, of being reduced to nothing more than a threat in the eyes of these men. Through the haze of shock, Jason caught a glimpse of his children's faces pressed against the window, their tiny hands on the glass, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. His heart shattered. What would they think of him now? How could they understand this nightmare unfolding before their innocent eyes? Kira screamed at the officers, her voice raw with rage and helplessness. "This is his car. This is our home. What are you doing?" But the officers were deaf to her pleas. One of them turned, his face cold and unfeeling. "Get back inside, ma'am, or you'll be next." Kira froze, her body trembling as the weight of the threat settled over her. She stepped back, her eyes locking with Jason's in a silent, desperate exchange. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, that this would all be over soon, but the words caught in his throat, drowned by the bitter taste of injustice. They hauled him to his feet, his arms twisted painfully behind him as they shoved him toward the waiting police car. His legs felt weak, as if they might give out beneath him, but he forced himself to stand tall. He would not let them see him broken. He would not give them the satisfaction of thinking they had won. "This is a mistake," Jason said again, his voice hoarse but steady. "Check my ID. My registration. They're in the glove compartment. I'm an attorney, and this is my home." But his words were swallowed by the night as the officers shoved him into the back of the squad car, the door slamming shut with finality. The cold, sterile interior of the car felt like a cage, the tinted windows blocking out the world, trapping him in this nightmare. Through the glass, he could see Kira standing on the sidewalk, her hand over her mouth, her body shaking with shock and disbelief. The porch light behind her flickered softly, casting long shadows over the once warm, inviting scene. Now it was a place of fear, of violence, of injustice. As the car pulled away, Jason's thoughts spiraled. He had spent his career fighting for justice, for equality, for change. He had won cases, reformed laws, and exposed corruption. But none of it seemed to matter now. Not when his skin color overshadowed everything else. This was the reality he had fought against for so long, and now it had come for him. On his doorstep, in front of his family, in front of his children. The drive to the police station was long and silent, the weight of injustice pressing down on him with every mile. And in that silence, Jason Carter vowed that this would not be the end of his story. The depth of silence. Jason Carter sat in the back of the squad car, his body aching from the forceful restraint of the handcuffs, his wrists bruised and swollen under the cold steel. The sound of the police siren echoed faintly in his ears, but inside the vehicle, all was quiet. An eerie, suffocating quiet that magnified the emotions churning inside him. The silence was not only external. It gnawed at him from within, wrapping around his chest and squeezing tightly. Every breath felt shallow, constricted by a sense of helplessness that was foreign to a man of his stature and success. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent years defending the rights of people unjustly accused, advocating for reforms, exposing corruption. He had entered law to dismantle the very systems that were now imprisoning him, treating him as nothing more than another statistic, a black man, presumed guilty before proven innocent. His entire career, his education, his achievements, none of it mattered now. To them, to the police officers driving him to the station, Jason was just a man in cuffs, another suspect, another threat to be neutralized. The cold steel pressed into his wrists again as he shifted slightly in his seat. He glanced out of the tinted window, but the familiar landmarks of his neighborhood had long vanished, replaced by the blurred lights of the city passing by. His mind raced, not just with the facts of what had just happened, but with the implications of it. What would happen next? How long before they realized their mistake, if they ever admitted it at all? How long before the truth, his truth, was allowed to matter? Jason inhaled deeply, willing himself to stay calm, but his thoughts wouldn't slow down. They kept flashing back to the look on his children's faces as they watched through. A low hum of chatter filled the station, officers moving about their routines, barely noticing Jason sitting there on the bench. His mind circled back to Kira, to her last expression as the squad car pulled away. There had been fear in her eyes, but also something more, a quiet determination. She would be fighting for him now, he knew that. She would be on the phone, calling everyone she could, demanding answers, demanding justice. She was as much a fighter as he was, and together they had always been able to weather the storms that came their way. But this was different. This wasn't a legal battle or a challenge in the courtroom. This was personal. This was a fight for dignity, for their very identity as a family. The sound of footsteps approaching brought Jason out of his thoughts. An officer, different from the ones who had arrested him, walked over with a clipboard in hand. His face was expressionless, the routine nature of his job etched into his features. He glanced down at Jason's paperwork, his eyes scanning the information. "Carter, Jason," he said, his tone impersonal. "You'll be processed soon. Do you have someone who can post bail?" Jason nodded, the words catching in his throat for a moment. "My wife," he said, his voice steady. "She'll handle it." The officer gave a curt nod, jotting something down on the clipboard before walking away. Jason leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for a brief moment, trying to center himself. He knew what came next. The waiting, the drawn-out process of paperwork and procedure, the slow grind of the system. But he also knew that, eventually, the truth would come to light. They would realize who he was, realize that this entire situation was a mistake. But that realization didn't change what had already happened. The damage was done. He had been humiliated, degraded, and treated like less than a man in front of his own home, in front of his wife and children. And no amount of apologies or explanations could undo that. The memory of being shoved to the ground, the cold bite of the handcuffs, and the sight of his children's tear-streaked faces would stay with him long after the legalities were sorted out. Jason sat in the silence of the station, his mind clear now, his emotions steady. He knew this fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but he also knew that he couldn't afford to let anger consume him. Anger was what they expected from him. It was what they had tried to provoke during the arrest. But he wouldn't give them that. Instead, he would channel this experience into something bigger, something that could change not just his life, but the lives of countless others who found themselves in similar situations. As the hours dragged on, and the station continued its indifferent rhythm, Jason made a silent promise to himself. He would not be broken by this. He would rise above it, just as he had risen above every obstacle thrown in his path. And when the time came, he would use this experience as fuel for the fight ahead. The fight for justice, for dignity, for the right to live without fear. And this time, he would make sure the whole world was watching. a city's heartbeat, the war for justice. The hours ticked by in slow, agonizing succession as Jason Carter sat on the hard bench in the police station, his back rigid against the cold cinder-block wall. The sterile atmosphere of the holding area felt like it was closing in on him, every second stretching endlessly. He had lost track of time. Whether it had been 2 hours or 6, he couldn't say. The hum of fluorescent lights above him buzzed incessantly, and the quiet murmur of officers milling around the station played in the background. Yet, despite the external noise, an oppressive silence filled Jason's mind. He had been processed like every other suspect in the system. Fingerprints inked and pressed onto forms, a mugshot captured with the stark flash of a camera, and a pat-down that left him feeling violated and stripped of his dignity. His mind, a usually sharp tool honed by years of legal practice, felt dulled under the weight of exhaustion and the gnawing frustration that grew with each passing minute. Jason's thoughts wandered to Kira. She would be at home with the children now, trying her best to hold it together. He could imagine her pacing the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as she called anyone who could help. Kira was a force of nature in her own right, just as fierce in her love for her family as she was in the courtroom where she worked as an advocate for women's rights. He had no doubt she was fighting tooth and nail to get him released, making calls to friends, colleagues, and anyone who might listen. But this wasn't just about a wrongful arrest anymore. The more Jason sat in that station, the more he realized this was something deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. He had known, as a black man in America, that the system was never designed to protect people like him. He had spent his entire career as a lawyer trying to dismantle the very machine that had now chewed him up and spit him out, indifferent to his successes, his reputation, or even his innocence. But tonight, it wasn't just his battle. It was the battle of every person of color who had been stripped of their humanity by a system that refused to see them for anything other than the color of their skin. The officer who had taken his information earlier walked past him again, glancing down at the clipboard in his hand. His eyes flicked over Jason briefly, but there was no recognition in his gaze, no acknowledgement of the fact that this wasn't just another arrest. Jason was used to that look, the one that said, "You're not who we think belongs here." In this moment, all of Jason's accomplishments meant nothing. His law degree, his victories in the courtroom, his status in the community, they were all invisible. Jason sat up straighter, his mind beginning to churn once more, fueled now by a growing sense of purpose. This would not break him. He would not allow himself to become another victim of the system he had worked so hard to reform. There was too much at stake, too much that needed to change. His entire career had been dedicated to exposing the ugly truths behind police brutality, the racial profiling that ensnared so many, and the institutional racism that allowed these injustices to continue unchecked. This moment, as personal as it was, had the potential to be something bigger, a turning point not just for him, but for all those who shared his experience. He thought of his clients over the years, the faces that had sat across from him in his office, their stories pouring out like wounds torn open. The young men who had been stopped and frisked for no reason, other than walking in the wrong neighborhood. The women who had watched their sons or husbands dragged away in handcuffs without explanation. The families who had lost loved ones to unnecessary violence. Each of those cases had left a mark on Jason's soul, a reminder that the system was broken, deeply and irrevocably broken. But for the first time, Jason wasn't on the outside looking in. He wasn't the lawyer advocating for change from the safety of the courtroom. Now he was in it. He was living it. The clang of the heavy metal door opening at the far end of the holding area drew Jason's attention. His eyes flicked over to see another group of officers leading a line of detainees into the booking area. A young man, no older than 18, shuffled in, his hands cuffed in front of him, his face set in a mask of defiance. Behind him, an older man, graying at the temples, stared at the floor as he was led toward the fingerprint station. Jason's heart sank. How many more lives were being funneled through this same system, each of them caught in the same trap, each of them seen as nothing more than a number to process. His mind raced back to the moments before the arrest, the sense of violation that had swept through him as those officers had slammed him against his own car, their hands twisting his arms behind his back as if he were a common criminal. The memory burned like a brand on his consciousness. No matter what explanations came later, no matter what apologies they might offer, the humiliation of that night would linger. It would stay with him, etched into his memory, a permanent reminder of just how fragile his position was in a society that still, after all these years, viewed black men as a threat. As he waited, his thoughts drifted to the community outside these walls. The city that sprawled out beyond the police station was a complex tapestry of cultures, histories, and struggles. It was a city Jason had always loved, despite its flaws. It had given him the foundation to build his career, the place where he and Kira had made a life together. But it was also a city torn apart by the same racial tensions that had now ensnared him. Jason knew that his story, once it got out, would stir the pot. The media would latch onto it, spinning headlines about the high-profile attorney wrongfully arrested outside his own home. But that wasn't the story he wanted to tell. He didn't want this to become another sensationalized news cycle, filled with outrage, and then quickly forgotten when the next scandal arose. No, Jason wanted this to mean something. He wanted it to ignite real change, not just for him, but for the countless others who never got their day in the spotlight. His phone call. That's where it would start. Jason leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He hadn't been given the opportunity to make the call yet, but when he did, it would set everything in motion. He would call his team at the firm, call his friends in the media, call every activist and advocate he knew. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. He would make sure of it. The thought of Kira again pushed its way to the forefront of his mind. She would have already reached out to their lawyer friends, no doubt rallying the troops. Jason smiled grimly to himself, knowing she was likely as furious as he was. Kira wasn't the kind of woman who stood idly by. She had been by his side through every battle they had faced together. And this one would be no different. But what of his children? Jason's chest tightened at the thought of Jordan and Maya, their innocent faces still fresh in his mind. What would they think of their father now? He had always tried to teach them to be proud of who they were, to stand tall in the face of adversity. But how could they understand what had happened tonight? How could he explain to them that, in the eyes of the law, their father had been seen as less than human? Jason took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. He would turn this moment into something more, something powerful, something lasting. His children would grow up knowing that their father had fought back, not with anger or violence, but with the truth, with justice. They would see that change wasn't just something you hoped for, it was something you fought for. As the hours stretched on, and the dull rhythm of the police station continued around him, Jason's resolve hardened. The fight was just beginning. The heavy door at the end of the hall swung open again, and this time, an officer called his name. Carter, Jason. Jason stood slowly, his body stiff from sitting for so long. He straightened his shoulders and walked toward the officer, his mind already focused on the next steps. Whatever happened next, he was ready. The officer led him down another narrow hallway, past rows of empty desks and flickering computer screens, until they reached a small room with a phone mounted on the wall. The officer uncuffed him, the cold steel falling away from his wrists with a click, leaving behind the bruises that would serve as a reminder of this night. Jason rubbed his wrists absently as the officer gestured toward the phone. "Make your call," the officer said, his voice clipped. Jason nodded and stepped forward, picking up the receiver. The line hummed in his ear as he dialed the number he had committed to memory long ago, the number that would set everything in motion. As the phone rang on the other end, Jason's thoughts crystallized. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every man and woman who had been brutalized, humiliated, and forgotten by a system that refused to see them as human. This was about his children, about their future, about ensuring that they wouldn't grow up in a world where they had to fear the very people sworn to protect them. The line clicked, and a familiar voice answered. "Kira." "Yes, it's me," Jason replied, his voice low but steady. "It's time." The unfolding storm. Jason Carter's voice echoed in the sterile silence of the police station's phone booth. His heart pounded as he spoke the words he had been waiting to say. "It's time." On the other end of the line, there was a brief pause, the kind of silence that holds weight, a silence pregnant with understanding. Then Kira's steady, strong voice responded with quiet determination. "I've already started." It didn't surprise Jason. He knew Kira, knew her spirit. She had likely been working from the moment the police car pulled out of their driveway, leaving her standing on the curb, helpless yet resolute. Jason could picture her now, her phone in one hand, her other hand gesturing in frustration, pacing the floor of their living room as she orchestrated the next steps with the precision of a general in battle. There was no doubt she had already activated their network of allies, lawyers, activists, media contacts, people who understood that this wasn't just another wrongful arrest. This was a symbol of the systemic rot they had both fought against for years. They've already reached out to the firm. The partners are drafting a statement. Everyone's on it, Jay. We're not going to let this go, Kira assured him, her words fierce, each one laced with determination. She was standing on the front lines now, taking on the battle that Jason couldn't fight from behind bars. His admiration for her grew with every syllable, his love for her grounding him, reminding him why he had to stay strong. "I know you won't let them forget this," Jason replied, his voice softening, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on him. "How are the kids?" The question lingered, and Jason already knew the answer before Kira even spoke. The thought of his children haunted him, Jordan and Maya, their wide, innocent eyes staring out the window as their father was manhandled by the police, thrown to the ground like a common criminal. They didn't deserve to witness that. No child should. But Jason also knew that Kira would be doing everything in her power to shield them from the worst of it, to soften the harsh reality of what had happened. "They're shaken up," Kira admitted, her voice cracking just a little. "Maya keeps asking when you're coming home." "Jordan. Well, you know Jordan. He's trying to act tough. But he's scared. They both are." Jason closed his eyes, the ache in his chest deepening. Jordan, their oldest, was only 10, but he was already beginning to understand the world in ways no child should. He was at the age where the complexities of race, justice, and power were starting to make themselves known, and Jason had tried, carefully, to prepare him for the realities of life as a black boy growing up in America. But no amount of conversation could have prepared him for what he had witnessed tonight. His father, a respected lawyer, being treated like a criminal in front of his own home. "I'll explain it to them when I get home," Jason said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he would say. How could he tell them the truth without shattering their sense of safety even further? How could he help them understand that even though their father fought for justice, sometimes justice was nowhere to be found? "You will get home soon," Kira said firmly. "I'm making sure of it." Jason nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I know you are." He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. "I need you to keep pressing them, Kira. Call every outlet we have. Push the story. They'll try to sweep this under the rug if we let them. They always do. I'm already on it. I've talked to Sasha at the Tribune, and Ray's going to run a story on his blog tonight. By morning, the whole city will know," Kira replied, her voice hardening with resolve. Jason felt a flicker of relief. Kira's tenacity was one of the reasons he had fallen in love with her. She was unrelenting when it came to protecting her family and standing up for what was right. If anyone could take on the system from the outside, it was her. But Jason knew this was just the beginning. The police department would fight back. They always did. They would paint him as aggressive, uncooperative, anything to justify their actions. It was the standard playbook. He had seen it too many times before. And this time, it was personal. "We can't let them control the narrative," Jason said, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. "You know how this goes. They'll spin it however they can. We need to get ahead of it." "I've already thought of that," Kira replied. "But Jay, I need you to be ready for the backlash. Once this gets out, they'll come for you, for us. They'll dig up everything. It's going to get ugly." Jason exhaled slowly. He knew she was right. As soon as this story broke, the city would divide. There would be those who saw the truth for what it was. Another instance of racial profiling. Another example of a black man being treated as less than human by the very people who were supposed to serve and protect. But there would also be those who sided with the police, who would say he deserved it, that he should have complied, that he must have done something wrong. They would scrutinize every aspect of his life, looking for any crack in his armor that they could exploit. "I'm ready," Jason said, his voice steady but resolute. "Whatever they throw at us, we'll handle it." The conversation was interrupted as the officer who had been watching him stepped forward, tapping his wrist impatiently. "Time's up," the officer said curtly, his expression betraying no sympathy. Jason nodded but kept the phone to his ear for just a moment longer. "I'll see you soon, Kira. I love you." "I love you too, Jay. Stay strong," she replied. And then the line went dead. Jason replaced the receiver with a quiet click, his mind already shifting gears. He had made his call, but now came the waiting. And in that waiting, he knew he would need to prepare for the fight ahead. It wouldn't just be about getting released. That was only the beginning. The real battle would be in the court of public opinion, in the media, in the streets. Jason knew that his story would become a flashpoint in the ongoing struggle for racial justice, and he intended to make sure that his voice, and the voices of those like him, were heard loud and clear. As he was led back to his holding cell, Jason's mind turned to the bigger picture. His arrest wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a deeply entrenched system of oppression that had been allowed to persist for far too long. He had seen it in his clients' cases, in the stories of families torn apart by police violence, in the statistics that painted a grim picture of racial disparities in arrests, sentencing, and incarceration. And now he had experienced it firsthand. This wasn't just about him. This was about something much larger. Inside the dimly lit holding cell, Jason sat down on the narrow bench, his back against the wall. The cold, hard concrete beneath him was a stark reminder of the reality he was facing, but he wasn't afraid. Anger simmered just beneath the surface, but it wasn't the kind of anger that consumed or clouded judgment. It was the kind of anger that sharpened the mind, that focused every thought on a single purpose. He thought back to the moments leading up to his arrest, the way the officers had treated him, their cold, dismissive attitudes, their immediate assumption that he was guilty simply because he was a black man driving a nice car in a nice neighborhood. They hadn't even given him the courtesy of listening to his explanation. They had made up their minds before they even approached him, their hands resting on their guns, their faces hard with suspicion. This wasn't just about them. It was about the system that allowed them to act that way. The system that taught them to see black men as threats, to assume guilt based on nothing more than the color of their skin. Jason had spent his entire career fighting that system, but now it was time for something more. It was time for real change, change that wouldn't come from inside a courtroom or through legal reforms alone. This was about shifting the culture, about forcing the world to see the humanity in people like him, in people who were too often reduced to statistics and stereotypes. Jason leaned back, his eyes closing for a brief moment as the weight of it all settled over him. He wasn't naive. He knew this fight would be long, difficult, and full of setbacks. But he was ready. He had no choice but to be ready. Not just for himself, but for his family, for his children, for the people who didn't have a platform or a voice. In the silence of his cell, Jason's resolve solidified. This was his fight now. He would take on the system not just as an attorney, but as a man who had experienced its cruelty firsthand. And this time, he would make sure the world listened. The door to the holding cell creaked open, and an officer stepped inside. "You've got a visitor," the officer said, his tone flat. Jason opened his eyes, curiosity sparking in his chest. He hadn't expected anyone to visit him so soon, but he stood up, straightening his shoulders as he followed the officer down the narrow corridor. His mind raced through the possibilities. Who could it be? Was it Kira, his lawyer, one of his colleagues from the firm? But as the door to the visitation room swung open, Jason froze. Standing on the other side of the glass, with a somber expression on his face, was someone Jason hadn't expected to see. Detective Marcus Avery, an old friend and a high-ranking officer in the very police department that had arrested him. Jason's pulse quickened as he stepped forward. This was no ordinary visit. Something bigger was at play. And whatever it was, it had just changed the entire game. The thin line between friendship and betrayal. Detective Marcus Avery stood on the other side of the thick glass in the visitation room, his expression unreadable, his eyes shadowed with a mixture of regret and unease. Jason Carter, now facing his old friend for the first time since his arrest, felt a swirl of emotions rise within him. Confusion, anger, and most unsettling of all, a deep sense of betrayal. He had known Marcus for years. They had grown up together in the same neighborhood, fought for the same causes, and even supported each other's careers. They weren't just colleagues or acquaintances, they were friends, or at least that's what Jason had always believed. But now, as Marcus stood there, dressed in his plainclothes detective attire with a badge clipped to his belt, Jason couldn't help but feel the weight of a new reality pressing down on him. This wasn't just a visit from an old friend. It was a visit from someone who now represented the very system that had brutalized him. "Marcus," Jason said, stepping toward the glass, his voice low but steady. "What the hell is going on?" Marcus shifted on his feet, his lips pressed into a thin line as he looked at Jason through the glass partition. For a moment, he said nothing, and the silence between them was filled with the tension of years of friendship teetering on the edge of collapse. Jason could see the conflict in Marcus's eyes, but he was in no mood to be patient. He had been waiting too long for answers that Marcus, as a high-ranking officer, could potentially provide. Finally, Marcus sighed and picked up the phone on his side of the glass, gesturing for Jason to do the same. Reluctantly, Jason grabbed the receiver and pressed it to his ear, his gaze never leaving Marcus. "I didn't want it to come to this, Jason," Marcus said quietly, his voice strained. "I swear, I didn't know until after it happened." Jason clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the phone. "Didn't know what, Marcus? That your officers decided to brutalize me in front of my family? That they dragged me off my property without so much as an explanation?" His voice rose with each word, the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiling over. "Or didn't you know that your brothers in blue don't see a black man in a nice car and think successful lawyer? They see a target, Marcus. And I was that target." Marcus's face tightened, and he looked away, as if the weight of Jason's words were too much to bear. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know, Jason. But it wasn't supposed to go down like this." Jason's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse quickening with the familiar sting of betrayal. "What do you mean, it wasn't supposed to go down like this? What exactly were they planning, Marcus? Tell me." Marcus hesitated, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one was nearby before speaking again. When he finally did, his voice was a low murmur, as if he were revealing a secret that could cost him everything. "There's been pressure from the top," Marcus began, his tone heavy with implication. "The department's been under scrutiny ever since you started exposing corruption in the force. You've been making waves, Jason, big waves. People aren't happy about it, especially some of the higher-ups who've been protecting their own for years. The case you won last week, the one that brought down Captain Hargrave, it shook the department to its core. They wanted to send a message. You were that message." Jason's stomach twisted. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. This wasn't just about racial profiling or a routine traffic stop gone wrong. This was retaliation, an orchestrated act of intimidation by the very institution he had spent years trying to reform. "They targeted me," Jason said, the words coming out like a bitter taste in his mouth. "They wanted to make an example out of me, to show what happens when you stand up to them." Marcus didn't meet his gaze. His silence was confirmation enough. Jason could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had always known that his work in exposing police corruption would make him enemies within the department, but he never thought they would stoop to this level, to target him personally, in front of his family, to humiliate him and drag his name through the mud. This was something else entirely. It was more than just an arrest. It was an assault on everything he stood for, on everything he had fought to change. "So what now, Marcus?" Jason asked, his voice hardening. "What are you going to do about it?" Marcus's eyes flicked up to meet Jason's, and for the first time, Jason saw something close to fear in his friend's expression. "I'm walking a fine line, Jason. You have to understand. I'm still in this department. I've been trying to clean it up from the inside, but it's not as easy as you think. There are people who will do anything to protect themselves, and right now, they see you as a threat." Jason's anger flared again, hot and sharp. "I am a threat, Marcus. But not just to them. To the entire system that allows this kind of thing to happen." Marcus let out a long breath, running a hand through his close-cropped hair. "You don't get it, man. It's not just the bad cops. It's the culture, the code of silence, the politics. I've been trying to fight it from the inside, but it's a beast, and right now you're standing in its path." Jason's mind raced as he processed Marcus's words. This wasn't just about the officers who had arrested him. It was about the entire structure of power that allowed those officers to act with impunity, knowing that the system would protect them. It was about the way racism was baked into the very foundation of law enforcement, and how attempts to challenge it were met with hostility, even from those who claimed to be reformers. "So what?" Jason asked, his voice cutting through the tension. "I'm just supposed to back off. Let them win. Let them bury me and move on like nothing happened." Marcus shook his head, a flicker of desperation crossing his features. "No, that's not what I'm saying. But you need to be smart about this. They're already painting you as the aggressor in this situation. The department's working overtime to spin the story. If you come at them head-on, they'll crush you, Jason. They've done it to others. They'll do it to you." Jason's blood boiled at the thought. Of course they would spin the story. It was the oldest trick in the book. The police would claim that Jason had been uncooperative, that he had resisted arrest, that the officers had no choice but to subdue him. It wouldn't matter that he had done everything by the book, that he had complied with their orders, that he had even offered to show them his ID and registration. They would twist the narrative to fit their agenda, and Jason knew all too well how easily the public could be swayed by a well-crafted lie. "I'm not going to sit back and let them do this to me, Marcus," Jason said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "I've spent my entire career fighting for justice, for accountability, and I'm not about to stop now just because they want to scare me into submission." Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Jason could see the conflict raging inside him. He knew Marcus wasn't a bad cop. He had seen the work Marcus had done over the years, trying to root out corruption from within the department. But there was something else, something deeper that Jason couldn't ignore. The fact that Marcus was still a part of the very system that had just brutalized him. And that, more than anything, made this moment between them all the more difficult. "They're not going to scare me into silence, Marcus," Jason continued, his voice steady. "I'm going to fight this, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows what they did." Marcus looked down at the floor, his expression pained. "I don't want to see you get hurt, Jason. You have to be careful. They'll come after you harder if you push too much." Jason's eyes narrowed, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "I've been hurt already. They dragged me off my property, Marcus. They threw me to the ground in front of my kids. My family had to watch as they humiliated me. I can't just walk away from that." A heavy silence fell between them. The weight of years of friendship balanced precariously on the edge of this moment. Marcus was caught in the middle, trying to walk the line between loyalty to his friend and loyalty to the department. But for Jason, the line had already been crossed. There was no going back now. "I'm going to fight," Jason said again, more firmly this time. "And if that means going up against the entire department, so be it." Marcus finally looked up, meeting Jason's gaze with a mixture of resignation and something that looked like admiration. "I figured you'd say that," he said quietly. I wanted to warn you. It's going to get ugly." Jason gave a short, bitter laugh. "It's already ugly, Marcus." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, the unspoken truth hanging in the air between them. Their friendship, once a solid bond forged in shared experiences and mutual respect, now felt fragile, cracked by the weight of their divergent paths. Marcus had chosen to fight the system from within, but Jason had always fought from the outside, tearing down the walls brick by brick. Now it seemed those two approaches were on a collision course. "I'll be careful," Jason finally said, though he knew there was no real safety in what he was about to do. "But I won't be silent." Marcus nodded, his eyes betraying a sadness that Jason wasn't sure he could fully understand. "I'll do what I can," Marcus said softly. "But don't count on any favors." Jason felt a pang of sadness himself, realizing that this might be the last time they stood on the same side of anything. "I'm not counting on anything, Marcus, except the truth." With that, Marcus hung up the phone, the receiver clicking into place with finality. He gave Jason one last look before turning and walking away, his shoulders heavy with the burden of the choice he had made. As the door closed behind Marcus, Jason sat in the empty visitation room, the silence pressing in around him. He had always known that this fight would be difficult, but now, as he stared at the empty chair on the other side of the glass, he realized just how much it might cost him. Friendships, trust, and maybe even his freedom. But Jason was ready, because for him, the fight for justice wasn't just personal, it was necessary, a battle beyond the courtroom. Jason Carter sat in the empty holding cell, the heavy silence around him broken only by the distant hum of activity within the police station. His conversation with Marcus had left him shaken, though not in the way he expected. He hadn't been scared by Marcus's warnings or the looming threat of a department out for blood. No, it was something deeper, the weight of a friendship lost, the realization that even in this fight, he was more alone than he had ever thought possible. But Jason knew the cost of standing up for what was right. He had seen it in the faces of his clients, those who had gone against powerful forces to demand justice. He had watched them struggle, suffer, and yet, through it all, endure, because that's what this fight was. It was endurance. It was standing firm even when the weight of the world tried to crush you. And tonight, that weight pressed heavily on Jason's shoulders, but he would not be bowed. As he sat there, his mind began to churn with the strategy he would need going forward. Kira had already activated their network of allies, and soon his story would be making waves across the city. He could already see the headlines: respected attorney brutalized by police outside his own home. The public would be outraged, the media would pounce, and for a few days, maybe even weeks, the attention would be on him, on this injustice. But Jason knew how quickly these stories could fade. He had seen it happen before. One moment, the world was focused on police brutality, racial injustice, and calls for reform. And then, just as quickly, the spotlight would shift, and the movement would lose momentum. That was the real danger, not the retaliation from the police department, not the public backlash, or the character assassination that would surely come. The real danger was that his story would be swept away, forgotten in the endless churn of the news cycle, leaving behind nothing but a few fleeting moments of outrage. He couldn't let that happen. Not this time. Jason stood, pacing the narrow confines of the cell, his mind racing. The law had always been his weapon of choice, but this fight would go beyond the courtroom. It would require something more, something that reached beyond legal briefs and courtroom arguments. He needed to engage the public, to make them see that this wasn't just about one man's wrongful arrest. This was about a broken system, one that had been designed to dehumanize and oppress black men like him for generations. And that system needed to be torn down, brick by brick, until there was nothing left but the possibility of true justice. The cell door opened suddenly, and Jason stopped mid-step, turning to see an officer standing in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "Carter," the officer said flatly, "you're being released." A rush of emotions surged through Jason. Relief, anger, and a grim determination. He knew this wasn't the end. The fact that he was being released now wasn't a victory. It was simply the beginning of a much larger war. Jason followed the officer down the narrow corridor, the fluorescent lights above casting harsh shadows on the walls. As they walked, Jason's mind raced through the steps that lay ahead. First, he needed to regroup with Kira and their team. He needed to make sure that the narrative was controlled, that his voice was the one leading the charge. The police department would undoubtedly be preparing their own version of events, and Jason knew that the first step in winning this battle was to control the story. As they neared the front desk, Jason saw Kira waiting for him, her arms crossed, her face a mixture of relief and barely contained anger. She was a storm waiting to break, and Jason could feel the tension radiating from her. But there was also something else in her expression, a quiet strength that filled him with a sense of solidarity. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "Jay," Kira said softly as he approached, her eyes scanning him for any sign of injury. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Jason replied, though the words felt hollow. Physically, he was unharmed, but emotionally, the scars of the night were already forming. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, and for a moment, they stood there in silence, letting the weight of the night settle between them. "I've already spoken to the firm," Kira said quietly as they walked toward the exit. "They're ready to move forward with legal action, and the press is all over it. We're going to push this hard, Jay." Jason nodded, though his mind was already a few steps ahead. "It's not just about the lawsuit, Kira. We need to make sure this doesn't disappear. We need to turn this into something bigger, something that forces real change." Kira stopped and turned to face him, her eyes sharp and focused. "I know," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "And we will. But we have to be smart about this. They're already spinning the narrative, trying to paint you as the aggressor. If we don't counter that immediately, they'll control the story." Jason's jaw tightened. He had expected this. The police department would claim that he had resisted arrest, that he had been uncooperative. They would dig into his personal life, searching for anything that could be used to discredit him. But Jason wasn't afraid. He had nothing to hide. His life had been built on integrity, on fighting for what was right, and he knew that no amount of spin could change the truth of what had happened. "We need to be proactive," Jason said as they reached the car. "I'll talk to the media myself. We need to make sure that the facts are out there. Everything, from start to finish. They're going to come after me, but I won't let them bury this." Kira nodded, her hand still gripping his. "I've already spoken to Sasha. She's ready to run the story as soon as you're released. We've got Reggie from the Tribune on board too. And the civil rights groups are mobilizing. People are ready to rally behind you, Jay." Jason felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much bigger, a movement that had been building for years, one that was now at a tipping point. People were fed up with the same old story, the same injustices, the same excuses. Jason's arrest was just the latest example of a system that needed to be dismantled, and he was ready to lead that charge. As they drove home, the city lights flashing by outside the window, Jason's mind churned with plans. He thought about the marches that would come, the rallies, the speeches. He thought about the legal strategies they would employ, the pressure they would put on the city's leadership to demand accountability. But more than that, he thought about the cultural shift that needed to happen. It wasn't enough to win in court. They needed to win in the hearts and minds of the public. People needed to understand that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern of systemic oppression that affected not just him, but millions of black and brown people across the country. By the time they pulled into the driveway of their home, Jason's resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. He had spent his entire career fighting for justice, but now the fight was personal in a way it had never been before. This wasn't just about legal reforms or policy changes. This was about challenging the very foundation of a system built on racism and inequality. As they stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, Jason saw Jordan and Maya standing just inside the house, their small faces pressed against the window, waiting for him. His heart clenched at the sight of them, at the innocence that had been shattered in a single night. They had seen their father humiliated, dragged away in handcuffs, treated as if his life had no value. But now, they would see something else. They would see their father rise up, not just as a lawyer, but as a man who refused to be broken by a system that sought to destroy him. Kira opened the door, and the kids rushed toward Jason, their arms wrapping around him in a tight embrace. He knelt down, holding them close, feeling the weight of their small bodies against his. This was what he was fighting for. This was why he couldn't back down. "Are you okay, Dad?" Jordan asked, his voice trembling with the fear he was trying so hard to hide. Jason looked into his son's eyes, seeing the uncertainty there, the confusion, the hurt. He wanted to tell him that everything was fine, that it would all be okay. But Jason knew better. The world wasn't okay, and pretending otherwise wouldn't protect his children from the reality they were growing up in. "I'm okay," Jason said softly, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "But we got work to do, Jordan. All of us. We're going to make sure that what happened tonight doesn't happen again." Jordan nodded, his eyes wide with understanding, even if he didn't fully grasp the weight of what Jason was saying. That night, as the family gathered in the living room, Jason sat with Kira and the kids, holding them close, knowing that the battle ahead would be long and difficult. But he was ready. He had no choice but to be. The next morning, Jason awoke early. He stood at the window, watching the sun rise over the city, the light casting long shadows across the streets. It was a new day, but the same fight, one that had been waged for generations. And now it was his turn to carry that fight forward, to ensure that the system that had wronged him, and so many others, would not stand unchallenged. Jason turned from the window, his mind clear and focused. Today, the world would hear his story, and this time, they wouldn't be able to look away.